You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 25th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The United States' European allies try to remind President Donald Trump whose side he's supposed to be on. Is Beijing concerned about being frozen out as relations between Moscow and Washington thaw? And how polite would you be to a billionaire who demands to know what you do all day? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Terry Stiastny and Charles Hecker will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll find out what recent upheavals in the transatlantic alliance have looked like from inside the office of NATO's Secretary General. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Terry Stiastny, the author and political journalist, and Charles Hecker, senior partner at Control Risks and author of Zero Sum, the Arc of International Business in Russia. And Charles, we have been in receipt of dozens, hundreds, thousands of emails from American listeners demanding to know when this book will at last be available on the Atlantic's other shore. Is there by any chance any news on that?
Your long wait is over and your prayers have been answered.
Amazing.
The release date for the United States of America is on the 4th of March, which is exactly 1 week from when we are recording this broadcast.
Has it been overtaken by events just yet?
The timing has been a bit tricky, and I wish I had planned it this way, but I haven't. But just as there is a rapprochement hanging in the air between Washington and Moscow, yes, there is a book that will tell you all about commercial relations between Washington and everybody else in Moscow. So the timing's not bad.
Well, Terry, we will in due course, sooner rather than later, I hope, be flogging your next book absolutely mercilessly to our listeners. But instead of actually writing it, you have been skiing.
I finished writing it, so I'm waiting for the next sets of proofs to come in.
So that's your excuse?
Yeah, that is my excuse. And
okay.
It was nice to sit on the top of mountains in Austria, trying not to look too far east and worry too much about everything. But, it was good. And I came back with all my limbs unbroken. So that is
extraordinary. That is not something I would back myself to return from a skiing holiday without having done, which is a long-winded way of explaining why I don't take ski holidays. Which particular bit of Austria were you skiing down?
St. Anton, which is sort of in the west, in the Arlberg, so towards Switzerland.
Would you broadly recommend it?
Very much so, yeah. Really good skiing, good food. Partly I go to Austria for the food. So that was, it was good.
Well, that is an excellent reason to go to Austria. But we will be starting with the Transatlantic Alliance, still a thing we can just about refer to in the present tense as of this broadcast. US President Donald Trump has come in from the golf course once this week to receive French President Emmanuel Macron, and is scheduled to do so again for UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. Both are frantically trying to keep the US interested in its decades-long role as guarantor of Europe's security generally, more recent job as principal benefactor of Ukraine specifically. However, the UK has today joined those countries scrambling for a Plan B, promising a significant spike in defence spending at the expense of international aid. Charles, first of all, how do we reckon Macron did at the White House? This is, of course, not his first rodeo where Trump is concerned.
No, and he's pretty good at it, actually, because when they're sitting there in front of the public at the press conferences, they look like they're very good friends and that they get along extremely well. And, of course, getting along well is what matters most of all to President Trump. I mean, I think that Macron walked a very fine line. Diplomacy is more art than science, and he walked the line between being diplomatic and pandering. Between being diplomatic and indulging a president who has been bullying most of his allies. And he seems to be saying most of the same things in public that we think he is saying in private. He corrected the president once during a press conference, and of course that was, tantamount to the world thinking that he declared war on the United States. But he got some more reassuring words out of Donald Trump during their public appearance than President Trump has been giving about Ukraine in the weeks leading up to Macron's visit.
Are there any lessons there, do you think, Terry, that should have been absorbed by Sir Keir Starmer and his people before he arrives? As Charles points out, there was an amount of flattery, to which I think it's fair to say President Trump responds, but there was also firmness, and actually quite publicly demonstrated firmness.
Yes, I think what Macron showed is that you can, to a certain extent, get away with flatly contradicting Donald Trump, perhaps if you have to put your hand on his arm to do so, which is, he managed to sort of get away with that. And then Trump only slightly looked off to the side and looked a little bit kind of chastened and sort of muttered things under his breath. But I think he did it well. He spoke in very good English. He was able to say this is not true about how Europe is paying for its aid to Ukraine. He said we're paying this ourselves. It's not just a loan. So he did manage to insist on the facts, but in a sort of charming enough way that Trump wasn't obviously humiliated. And I think Starmer might find that a bit more difficult because I think, as a character, he is a bit more awkward. He is a bit more stilted. It might be a bit more like when Theresa May met Donald Trump and there was a kind of, an awkwardness between them, which was partly, I think, of Theresa May, just how she dealt with everybody. But I think you've got to he's got to learn to stand up to him to a certain extent and say, these are the facts, this is how we understand it, but without making Trump look more of an idiot than is necessary.
I mean, Charles, if I'm trying to be optimistic about this, I do keep thinking back to that early 20th century Russian joke, which held that the two most powerful men in Russia were Tsar Nicholas II and whoever he just spoke to. But one concession Macron was willing to make was that he said there is good reason for Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin to have re-engaged. Now, does Macron mean that, and is that actually true, or was Macron just letting him have that one?
Well, I think what he's saying is that it's a good thing that the process began. The bad thing is that the process began without him, without Macron, and without the rest of Europe. And so I think what Macron will want to do and what Starmer will want to convince Trump of in the coming days is that Europe has to be involved in these conversations going forward. I mean, everybody agrees that there's nothing wrong with trying to stop a war. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. And so the ball is now rolling at this, or the starting gun has been fired. That's all fine. The problem is what happens next. And so in addition to seeking American guarantees for Ukrainian security going forward, the secondary but of equal importance goal really is to make sure that Europe is part of the conversation now.
Terry, one thing Starmer will be able to say to Trump when he gets there is that, look, we are now going to be meeting that NATO threshold on defence spending. It will be hiked up to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, which is earlier than scheduled. It's an extra 13.4 billion quid, which is obviously not nothing, but in the event of the United States wandering more or less completely off, is even that going to be enough?
I think in the grand scheme of things, obviously politically it's important. It's a statement of intent and it's something that to a certain extent Starmer wanted to do anyway. And this gives him a good reason to be able to do it. He is also going to face a lot of criticism, I think, on his own backbenches. We've seen that already today happening because in order to do this, he's basically saying, well, we're basically cutting the aid budget in order to spend more money on defence. And at a time when the US is pulling back from its aid budget as well, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say this is not necessarily going to help in terms of the bigger picture. But it does allow him to go to Washington and say, look, we're doing this thing that you wanted. I mean, even if he's not doing it for the reasons that the US wants, he's doing it because they think, we can't rely on the US to be there anymore.
I mean, granted that the money has to come from somewhere, Charles, but is it fair to suggest that this is somewhat cowardly because he knows that this is an easy win to go out in front? You rarely lose votes by going out in front of the British public, or indeed most publics, and saying we're going to spend less money on foreigners.
Yeah, of all of the decisions and of all of the financial trade-offs that the Prime Minister needs to make domestically, this one, you're right, is probably the easiest. It carries the added added benefit of smoothing the conversation with Trump before it even takes place, because Trump will now know that the United Kingdom is stepping up and coming closer to his demands for increasing defense spending among NATO members. He did not, as of this moment, get any pushback from the chancellor on his plans to spend more. And I guess that's because he's found a place to take the extra money from. But among all of the things that he had to do, this is probably the easiest one for him to get across.
Well, we will move along somewhat and consider a subplot of the United States' recent application to join the authoritarian axis. Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken his first call from his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping since US President Donald Trump signalled his indifference to the security of America's traditional allies in Europe. Once Putin and Xi had finished wiping away tears of shared laughter, they pledged themselves anew to mutual support and admiration, Xi apparently informing Putin that, and I quote, "History and reality show that China and Russia are good neighbours that cannot be moved away and true friends who share weal and woe. Russia's gain is Hallmark's loss." Charles, nevertheless, Russia's response struck me as somewhat restrained. I mean, granted that they're Russian and everything, and until they've had a few drinks are likely to be somewhat restrained, but they just said relations were warm and friendly.
Well, relations between Russia and China are probably the best they've ever been. And by the way, history doesn't always show that relations between Russia or the Soviet Union and China have been smooth. They have had their rough times, and they've had their peaks and their troughs. But if we think that Trump is being really clever here in sort of making approaches to Putin and that he will sort of wrench him away.
This is the five-dimensional chess analysis.
He's not playing it. And if we think that by, what's going on in the White House now and what's happening on the phone calls and what's happening in Riyadh, if we think that this is an attempt to sort of wrench Russia away from China, that's not going to happen. There is nothing to prevent Russia from carrying on in its relationship with China in exactly the same fashion that it has been since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began pretty much exactly 3 years ago. It can continue to warm its relationships with the United States. Its position vis-a-vis the United States, if it ever improves, will probably be as good as it was something like 14 years ago. Which didn't really pose much of a threat to China at all. So this five-dimensional chess is probably really just a game of checkers.
Another five-dimensional chess question, Terry, possibly six-dimensional chess. Do we think Trump perhaps envisions some great triple entente involving the United States, Russia and China, the world's superpowers, all friends?
Well, I was wondering about this. I was wondering, do we actually have a future where you see that these three countries all voting together on the UN Security Council? You kind of think history teaches you that having three great superpowers wanting to sort of trample all over everybody else ultimately doesn't last. So I can't imagine that if it were going to happen, would last for very long once it came into conflict with reality. But yeah, I don't really know. I don't think this is. I think it's more like kind of a slightly chaotic game of Risk. When you play it and then you suddenly go, I'm going to move all my armies into a different part of the world that no one's ever thought of having a war in. It's that kind of slightly sort of slapdash, I think, because there are so many other things going on between, US-China relations that, what is he actually going to do about tariffs? What is he actually going to do about Taiwan? What do they really want to do in terms of trade? So I don't think we get the sense of it being kind of a hugely thought-through strategy.
Charles, it has been conventional wisdom these last 3 years that Russia has become very much the junior partner in the relationship with China, that China is standing over it in some respect or another. Some suggestion even that Xi Jinping could end the entire Ukraine misadventure with one yank on the appropriate plug. But might Putin now think he has, if not the upper hand, but is reapproaching parity?
So here's if Russia is smart, and that's a big if. If Russia is smart, and if Putin is smart, it has the opportunity, perhaps, to do a little bit of playing the ends against the middle, because we're told that we're on the verge of a cleavage into two spheres of influence globally. I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, but this is what sort of people are talking about at the moment. And the automatic assumption is that the two spheres of influence is one led by the United States and one led by China. Mm-hmm. So where does that leave Russia? Where does that leave Europe, for that matter, or India? And so if Russia's feeling that there's a risk of it being squeezed between these two superpowers, then yeah, it could get what it wants out of a relationship with China. It can get what it wants out of a relationship with the United States. The Europe question is entirely separate because of the geographic proximity. But it can probably do that, if it's smart, without thoroughly aggravating both parties.
Just finally on this one, Terry, it is a question about diplomatic language, and Charles alluded to this earlier, the bit about China and Russia, good neighbours that cannot be moved away, etc. Everybody knows that's not true. I mean, everybody with even the vaguest understanding of Sino-Russian relationships down the decades knows that isn't true. And I'm not just asking about this particular one, but about diplomatic language. Why say the thing that everybody knows isn't true?
I think it's a statement of intent, isn't it? It's to try and say, look, we are showing the rest of the world that this is what we want you to believe. And they're, two sort of autocratic regimes where they believe that by repeating the line that people might believe it. And, we're talking about it, that people are starting to look at it. They're not going to issue a statement where it says, well, we get on right, we've got a few issues about certain things. So they've got to put it out there, like sort of reminds me of the Neighbours theme tune.
Well, this won't remind you of the Neighbours theme tune. I mean, unless there was a Brazilian spin-off of Neighbours and they commissioned some Brazilian music for it, I've got absolutely no idea. But to Brazil, which is gearing up for Carnival beginning this Friday, and very pleased to see both panellists getting into the spirit of the thing with their ornate headdresses. Last year, Brazilian broadcaster Globo attracted a measure of contumely for ditching the journalists and experts who have traditionally anchored the coverage in favour of influencers, i.e. idiots with gleaming dental implants who are somehow making a living standing next to things on Instagram. This year, however, the hacks are back, and it now falls to this table of journalists to offer a rigorously impartial and punctiliously disinterested analysis of this development. Terry, we're pleased about this, aren't we?
We are pleased about this, yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. We want slightly dull and people who actually know what they're talking about to talk about things like this. What I didn't realise until I looked into this, very superficially, like on an influencer level, is that...
Are you available for next year's Carnival, Terry?
I am, yeah. I'll do the headdress. I'll do, possibly wear too many clothes than you're supposed to. But I didn't realise that it's effectively a cultural thing and like a sports match.
It's a whole thing.
League tables and rankings. Mm-hmm. And so there's actually a whole lot of stuff to know. It's not just that's a nice outfit, which might be the thing that the influencers would be good at doing.
That is apparently literally what happened. We were steered towards this, as regular listeners may have guessed, by our Brazil desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, who was saying it was a genuine thing last year, because there are people for whom, being Carnival expert is literally their job. They are the people who know all the rankings and the tables and the backstories and the histories and the symbolism, and they were all elbowed aside last year, and I am delighted that so many people were up in arms about it. But the question becomes, Charles, if you have people who obviously know their subject and are competent broadcasters, why not just let them do it? Is this their bosses misjudging their audience, just assuming, we must have, what are young people into? They like influencers, whatever they even are, let's get some of them.
This was an attempt to do whatever it is that the cool kids are doing. It sort of reminds me, you recall the debate a few years ago over, I think it was called native advertising or native content, when magazines and newspapers tried to insert brand messaging into their articles. And if it wasn't labeled, it was down to the reader to figure out whether they were reading genuine news content or whether they were reading something that was written by the editorial equivalent of influencers. I wonder if the tide isn't turning against influencers now. In London, for example, restaurants are instituting a minimum spend when you make a booking. And this is to keep influencers who come into a restaurant, order a salad, and share a glass of wine, take lots of really nice pictures, and then leave.
I can think of more robust means of discouraging them.
Well, before we resort to sort of physical coercion, we're eliminating them by squeezing them out of the marketplace by making it very, very expensive to be an influencer. And so maybe this was the Brazilian media's attempt to be cool, and then maybe they realize that it isn't, and perhaps everyone else is cottoning onto that as well.
Well, it's not a new phenomenon, though, Terry. I mean, it's still a fairly frequent thing that you will tune in to watch some sort of, documentary, for example, about history or current events, and the people who are broadcasting it do not have the confidence to put somebody who knows what they're talking about in front of it, and instead has just found somebody who looks nice, who viewers may recall from some other thing they were on.
Yeah, I think it's probably a more widespread phenomenon. I think it's part of the sort of the mistrust of experts. It's that we'd rather have somebody broadcasting who is relatable, who they think that the audience will like, even if they don't know, all the in-depth history. I'm thinking of other events that, I don't know, when we have royal occasions here in the UK, you usually have, you might have some sports person who sort of said, yeah, I once met the king and shook his hand, and doesn't really, whereas actually what you need is the person who says, this is the reason that they're wearing that particular hat or whatever it is. There is a whole load of actual knowledge there. Or also, something like the Oscars as well, where I think, that's tended to be a lot of influencers now who are sort of commenting on the clothes or whatever, rather than people actually talking about the films and what was a good film and what the background is.
Charles, have you ever been moved to put your foot through the television by some inappropriate casting where there should have been an expert?
All the time. And it's just that the only problem is that it's getting harder and harder to put your foot through the television because of flat screens. When you had genuine cathode ray tubes, it was really easy to kick them in. These days, it's a lot harder to beat up on your television, although I want to do it with increasing frequency. Well,
we will look now to the US and what is surely the most macro attempt at micromanaging in human history. Supernaturally annoying tech bro Elon Musk, currently licensed to do for the US federal government what he once did to Twitter, i.e. turn a broadly functional service into a blazing garbage barge, is still awaiting responses from many of the hundreds of thousands of public servants he emailed at the weekend, demanding that they justify their wages by explaining what they'd done last week in the form of 5 bullet points on pain of dismissal. In days since, though Musk has repeated the demand, several government departments have told their staff not to bother. Terry, my view of this is that any US federal public servant should be sacked who did not reply to Elon Musk asking, "What did you do last week?" with the 2 words, "your mum."
I think you should also then reply all to 2.3 million people, so that then everybody is looking around going, "Can you take me out of this conversation?" And the whole thing will just completely collapse. But it is absolutely bizarre. I mean, he's sort of effectively saying, "I'm bumping this up again to the top of your inbox," but kind of doing it by Twitter, and then Trump saying, "You'll be sort of semi-fired," or it's chaotic. And even some of the departments that have told people, "Do not reply to this. Don't be an idiot." I mean, even Health and Human Services.
Don't be an idiot is also a good reply.
It's also, it is a very good reply. But, assume that what you write will be read by malign foreign actors, is what from one government department's response. And that's from Health and Human Services run by RFK. So
it's possibly a technically accurate description of Elon Musk. Charles, what would you reply if you were in receipt of such an email? I'd reply with 1 bullet point that I can think of.
I wonder if you can sort of retroactively put your out-of-office email on and say, "I'm sorry, I'm away from my desk right now, but your email is very important to me, and I'll return your message as soon as possible." I would seek to sort of retroactively instate my out of office email. I don't know what I would do. I think I would, it's easy for us to all pretend that we were in this position. I know somebody who does work for, has a reasonably chunky job in a reasonably chunky U.S. department.
Have they received one of these emails?
And they did receive one of those emails. The instructions that they got from their supervisor was that that replying is optional, and if you do, be careful not to put anything, confidential or, secret in it.
That doesn't rule out profane or abusive.
No, that's true. I suppose you could reply with a sense of humor. But then, as far as provoking the ire of Elon Musk and sort of getting automatically fired, not that he's got time to review all of the millions of emails that are going to come back into his inbox. I think I like best of all Terry's approach of doing reply all. Absolutely genius.
But all jokes aside, Charles, I mean, this is a thing that is happening. This is tens of thousands of, I'm sure, largely entirely diligent and hardworking public servants who are now absolutely terrified for their livelihoods and wondering what the hell they're even doing.
That's right. I know a lot of people who live in Washington, and the only word that they use to describe what's going on in their hometown and in the town of their work is chaos. And genuinely speaking, a number of friends who live in Washington say they wake up every morning not knowing what's going to happen to them at work. And the sad thing in all of this, among all of the sad things, is that these are people who have chosen government service out of a deep sense of conviction, and they are being prevented from doing their jobs. And not only are they being prevented from doing their jobs, they don't know if they'll ever be able to do them again. So it's chaotic, and the only sort of object that's going to suffer from all of this is the U.S. government and the people that it serves itself.
The thing is, though, Terry, I think it's probably the case, and I'm not taking Elon Musk's side here, but it is probably the case that in any organisation past a certain size, there probably are people who don't really need to be there. There probably are people whose work is not actually all that vital. So is the question, what did you actually do last week, necessarily a terrible one if it is asked in, I suspect, better faith than it is being asked here?
I think if you start the process from the other end, rather than just assuming you're going to fire loads of people, you could, if you went in and said which of these people are not necessary, replying to an email, if you're fighting a forest fire out in a national park or something, you're not going to be checking your email. The person who responds most quickly to this kind of email is probably one of the ones that you actually need to get rid of because they haven't got anything better to do. So, I don't think it's not obviously a well-constructed way of deciding which people, if you need to cut headcount, are the people who need to go.
I mean, Charles, this very definitely falls under the category of micromanaging, which is it's not something most people enjoy, or at least I can't imagine who would. It's not something, at least, that I've ever seen ever actually gets positive results. And as somebody yourself who has written about business, that title again, Zero Sum. When's it out in the US again, Charles? Next Tuesday, wasn't it?
It's out next Tuesday, the 4th of March.
Next Tuesday, the 4th of March. Does it ever actually work? And if it doesn't work, where does it come from? Why do people do it?
Well, no, exactly. I mean, if one of the things that Elon Musk is trying to accomplish, one of the things that he's trying to accomplish in this sort of campaign of terror on federal employees, if he's trying to root out the deep state, then why is it that he's trying summarily to sack individuals who are still on probation, which means you're new enough in your role that you probably haven't put down roots into the deep state. So, it's just, and I think, even though it's the Department of Government Efficiency as it's labeled, he's going after departments where he has business. He's going after agencies that regulate his commercial affairs. And he's going after, places that, and he's also going after places that have very, very rich seams of data for a company that's building an artificial intelligence model. So, no, micromanagement never works. It doesn't work at the corner bakery and it doesn't work in the federal government. The problem is that he's up to a lot more than that.
And Terry, just finally on the subject of micromanagement, in the journalistic realm, this usually manifests as the overtly pernickety editor. Have you yourself, because I have, and to be clear, I am referring to nobody here at Monocle, which is one of the reasons I've been here so long, but have you ever found yourself driven to grim fantasies of revenge, possibly involving the assembly of a voodoo doll, when the same person sent you the 87th irritating email complaining that there are too many E's in this sentence or something?
It's more about, have you tried to get hold of that person that we talked about you trying to get hold of? It's like, yes, I have tried several times. When they get back to me, but you're asking me to speak to, the President of the United States or whoever it is, it may be some time. Can you just please leave me alone until when I know I will let you know. is the one that got me.
Terry Stiastny and Charles Hecker, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, this was always going to be a period of transition at NATO, from one Secretary-General to another, and from one US administration to another. At last week's Munich Security Conference, there was much nervous contemplation of a possible bigger transition, i.e. the transition of the US from the centre of the alliance to a more detached role, if we were lucky. Amid this considerable consternation, I spoke to Benedetta Berti-Alberti, Head of Policy Planning at the Office of the NATO Secretary-General, and I began by asking if this Munich Security Conference had felt notably different to her.
Since 2022, since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, Munich Security Conference has felt even more important. There's been more sense of urgency. So in that sense, I see continuity. I think what is very interesting this year is, of course, there are a lot of open issues on the table. So it's incredibly interesting to hear people's perspectives, to think about the future. But what remains constant, at least in my experience over the last few years, is this greater sense of urgency with respect to strengthening deterrence and defense, investing more in defense, and stepping up what we do as Europeans. So that would be a constant theme that I've heard over the past few years.
But the definite not constant theme this year was the line we heard from a very different kind of US administration, because the last couple of Munich security conferences, for all that urgency you mentioned about Ukraine, it has been more or less the traditional transatlantic backslap. Everybody gets together and agrees that the Western alliance is marvelous, unified, indivisible, etc. That's not been the case this year.
Well, I think some of the underlying themes, which is in order for the transatlantic alliance to remain strong as it is, we need to do more, especially as Europeans. I think that is not a new theme. I think it's something that, especially since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, has become blatantly clear to all of us that the post-Cold War peace dividend era is over, and we have to emphatically reinvest in our defense, ramp up industrial production. So I think the underlying theme that we need to take more responsibility through greater burden sharing, greater defense spending, investment in our transatlantic defense industrial base, that is not a new theme. And I think in a way that will remain a defining issue for the years to come, not because of internal dynamics between the alliance, but because of the security environment at large. In other words, because we are in a less benign security environment, more complex, more dangerous, Russia's war of aggression, a more increasing competition with China, and so I don't think that in that sense the overarching theme about increasing responsibility and strengthening defense is dramatically new.
Is all that going to be possible, though, if members of the alliance start feeling like they can't take its most powerful member for granted?
Well, I would say that alliances are about collective responsibility, are about standing with each other, but they are about not taking each other for granted. They are about working together. They're about showing up for each other. They're about taking responsibility. So in other words, I wouldn't say that any member of the alliance should take any other member for granted. I think that's the whole point. We all have to work for it, especially in a time where we have a clear threat from a transatlantic perspective in the Russian Federation, where we have increased destabilization campaigns in our countries, where we have the pacing challenge from China. So in that context, we shouldn't take each other for granted. Nobody should, and we should all pull our weight.
I mean, is there, because I'm sure you've heard this talked about, if we've heard it talked about, and we have this idea that maybe we do need to think about some sort of separate European defence structure which is parallel to NATO, those countries which know they can rely on each other if they're not sure that they'll be able to rely on the United States forever, or would that just create confusion and chaos of the kind that an external enemy could exploit?
Well, I would start by saying that the fundamental idea that our security, Europe and North America, is best assured by working together, that fundamental principle to me is not in question. It's about how do we show up for each other more, and how Europeans take a greater share of responsibility for our common security, which I think is a very important conversation, not a new one, and one that will continue. So in that sense, that's a starting point. I think the transatlantic alliance remains the pillar of our collective security, and NATO remains the main organizing principle for the defense of Europe. So in addition, when we talk about parallel structures, I'm a little hesitant because we have one set of forces, and that set of forces already needs to meet a number of very important requirements for our collective defense. So if you start splitting up forces, creating parallel structures in a context of finite resources, you may end up getting two less effective parallel structures as opposed to one that works well. And we know that the NATO command structure, that the architecture that has been set up over the past decades to ensure the territorial defense of Europe works well. So I would say we should continue to invest in it. We should modernize it. We should complete the reset of our deterrence and defense that has been ongoing for the past decade. I don't necessarily think that now it's the time to improvise and try to come up with alternative solutions.
Obviously, this conference has been consumed with Ukraine, as this conference has been for the last few years, but is NATO focused on anything else in particular beyond Ukraine, or is it mostly just about, because it just strikes me that now NATO and Europe in particular is kind of facing one kind of threat from Russia and potentially a different kind of as yet undefined threat, depending on what the United States does in coming weeks and months. When you've got those two pressures in each direction, is it hard to concentrate on other stuff?
Well, I might not I might rephrase a little bit your framing, because I don't see things necessarily in the same way, but I would say yes, our to-do list has been very, very dynamic in the past few years as a reflection of the security environment. So as a reflection of the threats and challenges we have. And that means that we don't have the luxury of focusing on only one issue or even one threat or threat actor. We need to do multiple things at the same time. That's part of the complexity of the security environment. So if I had to say, what are some of the priorities right now? Well, some I laid out, working to complete and to accelerate the implementation of our deterrence and defense posture adjustment. What does it mean? It means more troops at high readiness, more capabilities, more exercises, full implementation of our defense plans that were agreed a couple of years ago. So that is about what we do for ourselves, what we do to ensure that our deterrence and defense is credible today. And that's very important, and that's a big chunk of the NATO work. Then there's work that we do in terms of how do we contribute to resilience in allied countries? How do we support deterrence through resilience, but also through imposing costs on adversaries and competitors when they use non-kinetic means? So this would be, for example, the new Baltic-centric mission that we launched to contribute to vigilance and deterrence in the Baltic Sea.
This is protecting undersea cables and so on.
Exactly. So that's the resilience and dealing with the non-kinetic, so the non-military challenges that we see. Then there's the work, of course, to support Ukraine here and now with assistance so that they can continue to defend themselves, but also thinking about the longer term force development and ensuring that in the future they will be able to also deter against potential future aggression. So it's not about we simply don't live in a world where we can only do one thing. We need to build our deterrence and defense. We need to work with the industry so that we can ramp up production so we have the capabilities we need.
That was Benedetta Berti Alberti, Head of Policy Planning at the Office of the NATO Secretary-General, speaking to me at the recent Munich Security Conference. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Terry Stiasny and Charles Hecker. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.